you, Marco, and thank you to all the organizers for this amazing conference. Thank you all for participating. Clearly, I would say the demand was there. We thought that there was a need for a truly international, a truly accessible, and truly kind of inclusive conference in the philosophy of mind and the sciences of the mind. And I think we've been proven right. So, of course, the organizers put a huge amount of effort into organizing this conference. I don't know of any other conference on this scale in philosophy. So I think that's an accomplishment in of itself. And so I hope that we're all pleased with the way things are going. I also been in the various sessions as much as possible, and the quality was really impressive to me. What I'm going to talk about is the way I see connections between different disciplines and different core ideas about the mind and cognition. One possible starting point is the cognitive hexagon. When I went to undergrad in the early 90s, this is one of the things that I studied. And over the years, I've become unsatisfied with this model of the connection between the so-called cognitive sciences. I'm not going to say everything that I think is problematic with this, but just a couple of things. One is that it keeps psychology and neuroscience as distinct, whereas I don't think they're distinct. I think they're basically integrated into mostly the same enterprise, but of course, linguistics is also part of that. And another thing that I find problematic with the way that this cognitive hexagon was conceptualized initially is that it doesn't mention explicitly biology, specifically evolution. And I don't think this is an accident, because many of the early cognitive science proponents and researchers either didn't really care about evolution, or in some cases explicitly argue that the science of cognition should proceed separately from any considerations about evolution. And generally speaking, the way mainstream cognitive science discussed various topics or theorized about them didn't really bring in evolutionary considerations. Now, the inspiration for this talk comes largely by reflection on the so-called modern evolutionary synthesis. This is a term coined and popularized by Julian Huxley in a book that's now several decades old. But it's been recognized as an important accomplishment in the mid-20th century to synthesize primarily Darwinian natural selection with Mendelian genetics, as extended by the idea of population genetics and the techniques of population genetics, in combination with other important biological disciplines, branches, ideas. So this is not now, the modern synthesis with respect to evolution is not just a way of connecting distinct disciplines. It's a way of connecting core ideas and techniques that come from different aspects of biology. So, natural selection is not just a discipline. It's an idea, it's a concept, it's a theory, and so is genetics. And developmental physiology, yes, it's a discipline, but it's also a series of techniques for studying certain phenomena. And so is ecology, and so is systematics, and so is paleontology, and so is cell biology. Mathematical analysis is often included in this set, and it speaks to the fruitfulness of using mathematical or computational models in biology. And also there's a bit of a implicit reference to the usefulness of techniques that may be derived even from physics and considerations that could be derived from physics. So, this is not an exclusive list. In fact, there is a extended evolutionary synthesis, which has been proposed in more recent years. There's a whole debate about what it should or shouldn't include, but the basic idea is that it goes beyond what is considered the standard components of the modern evolutionary synthesis to include things like epigenetics, evolvability, multi-level selection, and genomics. Now, that's not really the topic of my talk. It's just the inspiration. But it is related because so I'm going to go through what I consider to be important aspects of a kind of unified account or science of cognition, and to stick with the source of inspiration for this way of thinking, I'm going to start with evolution. So the received view is cognitive science should find proximate explanations, meaning the kinds of things that you can study in a psychology lab or maybe in a neuroscience lab, and not worry about evolution. Brains don't leave fossil records anyway. What do we know about evolution of the brain, of the mind? Nothing, or very little. So forget about it. And I don't think that's the best approach. There's the famous Dobzhansky's dictum, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, to which some classical cognitive scientists might respond, well, too bad, because we don't know about the evolution of the mind. But instead, what I would say is cognition is a biological trait, or maybe a series, a collection of biological traits, and therefore cognition does make sense in the light of evolution, just like everything else in biology. Which is not to say that we can easily reconstruct the evolution of the mind, but there's things that we can learn by thinking in evolutionary ways, or in ways that that draw from evolutionary thinking. So there's one other thing that was missing from the cognitive hexagon, and that's behavioral biology. So there are a lot of biologists who study behavior, including behavior in animals that bear various similarities to humans. Not that the humans should be just the only thing that we worry about, but even insofar as we're trying to understand human cognition, it might help to compare human cognition to other animal cognition, other species. So we do learn by studying other species things that can help us understand ourselves, and also things that can help us understand cognition in general. And then there's comparative psychology and neuroscience, but I'll get to neuroscience pretty soon in a different slide. There's evolutionary neuroscience itself. All of these ways of thinking, ways of analyzing problems can yield insights, and they can help us understand, theorize about cognition. And now I need to address a possible concern that some people might have, which is, okay, oh boy, did Piccinini go evolutionary psychologist? And the answer is no. I'm not endorsing so-called evolutionary psychology with capital E, capital P, for example, the kind of program defended by Cosmides and Tooby, even though there may well be lots of insight there as well. But one of the weaknesses of evolutionary psychology, the kind of strong program in evolutionary psychology, is the assumption that the mind is made out of these so-called modules, each of which corresponds to an adaptation for a specific problem, kind of evolutionary problem. I think there is, it's at the very least very questionable whether the mind is massively modular in that way, where like each, quote unquote faculty, or rather behavioral task that has evolutionary significance is observed by a mental module. I personally don't believe that. I don't think the evidence is very strong for that, and I think there's plenty of evidence against it. So I am not defending massive modularity or evolutionary psychology in the strong sense of Cosmicism 2B, but I'm pointing out that no matter how much of cognition is learned, how much of our cognitive abilities are learned, and in many, especially in many other species, but probably in humans as well, not everything is learned. The mind, there's still innate constraints that evolved over time. And I'll give you an example in which I was involved. And it's an argument, it's somewhat speculative, but I think it's plausible. Armin Schultz and I have argued that there's two kinds of psychological altruism, most likely. There's a kind of psychological altruism that's more directly psychological altruism, meaning the desire to help others without the ultimate desire to help others, where ultimate means it's not derived from another desire. Okay, but we argue that there's two mechanisms for generating these ultimate altruistic desires. Some are more say innate, and they're likely to evolve in conditions when helping others is intergenerationally reliable, and so does not need to be learned. Examples of that would be helping your own offspring, or helping maybe other family members who are needy, or even maybe in-group members that are in severe need, like in injured and in pain or something like that. Now, there are other kinds of altruistic behaviors that also might be advantageous, and there might be evolutionary pressure to evolve them, and to evolve ultimate altruistic desires to produce these behaviors, but they would require learning. So in that case, we call that non-classical psychological altruism, because the kind of mechanism for generating those desires might require a kind of learning process that involves maybe reinforcement learning or something like that, plus maybe other kinds of mechanisms like bonding and maybe some empathy that's directed towards in-group members that are seen as reliable helpers in the future or something like that. So anyway, the point is just that this is an example where evolutionary considerations can help us disentangle theoretical issues in psychology and neuroscience and the sciences of cognition. Okay, so that's step number one. Step number two is that neuroscience has to be involved in its science and cognition. This is not going to come as a surprise to many people, but still there is a received view that's still very powerful in some corners of psychology, including classically minded people, but also some ecological types, dynamicists, where many of them don't seem to appreciate the importance of the neural mechanisms of cognition. But neural systems are the primary organs of cognition, no matter how much the body and the environment are also involved. I have argued at some length that, in fact, contrary to the classical assumption, psychology is not autonomous from neuroscience. And so it's not a good idea to proceed with your psychological theorizing independently of what we know about the brain. And I can't repeat all my reasons here, but briefly, the basic idea is that functions and structures are interdependent. They constrain each other. If you're performing certain functions, there are only certain kinds of structures and organizations of structures that can perform those. And if you have certain structures organized in certain ways, they can only do certain things and not others. So it really helps to study both. Now, it might not be enough. The system might be so complicated that it takes a lot of effort, and you might need to bring in other constraints. For example, evolutionary thinking, evolutionary constraints. But certainly you want to have both, and you don't want to just proceed studying the functions without also learning what we know about the structures. And this is true even with respect to computation, which was the kind of paradigmatic example of the kind of phenomenon where supposedly you didn't need to learn the structure or to study the structure because, for example, if the structure is a general purpose computer, then all you need to know is the program that it's running and not the, anything about the processor. Well, I don't think that's correct, but in any case, you also need to establish that it has that kind of processor, that it has a general purpose processor, and that requires studying the structures involved still. Okay. Now, one other minor, secondary point in this in this area is that we shouldn't think of the brain as just the cortex. A lot of philosophers and psychologists sometimes overemphasize the cortex and de-emphasize or maybe just ignore the rest of the brain or the nervous system. But the nervous system includes a lot more than the cortex and even a lot more than the brain. It includes the spinal cord and all the nerves. And all of those are important to cognition. So, a properly integrated, properly unified study of cognition needs to take all of that into consideration. Okay, there are a lot of branches of neuroscience. I've listed them at the bottom, at least the main ones that I could think of. And all of them have something to contribute. Moving to mechanisms. Okay, so how do we study the organ of cognition? I think what we're looking for is mechanisms. And again, here, there was an aspect of the traditional received view, especially when it comes to classical cognitive science, but even some of connectionist cognitive science. The idea was that cognitive explanation, explanational cognition is functional and specifically computational. And so therefore, that's distinct and autonomous from mechanistic explanation. So there's this idea that psychology or cognitive science studies the computations, the algorithms, and the representation, the Mars computational and algorithmic levels, and then neuroscience is going to have to worry about the implementation. But the psychologist doesn't have to worry about it too much. The implementation, the mechanisms. And again, I've argued at some length that that's not a good way to think, because again, even in the case of computation, we do need to understand the mechanisms to understand what kinds of computations they can perform or they do perform. There's no way to understand cognition, even the computational aspects of cognition, without studying the mechanisms involved, the computing mechanisms in this case. Now, there is a debate about how strongly or weakly decomposable neural systems are. And sometimes mechanistic explanation is associated with a strongly decompositional assumption to the effect that each function is subserved by a specific part of the system. So each part has one and only one function, and each function has only one component part that subserves that function, and therefore you could study the functions of each part in isolation from the other parts. I am not making any of these assumptions here. Everything I'm saying is intended to be compatible with almost about as strong a holistic perspective on the neurocognitive system as you can have. So it's consistent, for example, with everything that Luis Pessoa says. I think he's in the audience today. So hi, Luis. Thanks for coming. And, he's a strongly holistic neuroscientist. so he has argued, and many others have argued that that you can't really understand the individual function, computational or otherwise, of a part of the nervous system in isolation from the way it interacts with the others. That Dan Burston is another one in philosophy who has argued along these lines that the function of a part of the brain is very context dependent. Each part of the brain forms kind of coalitions with other parts to solve different tasks, and depending on what task is being performed or solved in combination with which other parts of the brain, an individual part might do different things. So what I'm saying is consistent with that. So it's a kind of, if you want, you call it a weak form of decomposition of the system or decompositionality, and it's consistent with a kind of mechanistic explanation in a broad sense. I stress this because some people are still arguing over whether the brain or something as is a mechanism or we need another way to think about it. There's some people who defend organicism as an alternative to mechanistic explanation, but organicism says that this is an organism and organization is important. Well, yes, mechanists, at least like new wave mechanists, have taken on board the importance of organization. Organization is crucial, and in fact, there are all these interesting series of constraints that affect one another. They make each other possible. There's very interesting work by Stuart Kaufman and by a group of philosophers based especially in Spain, like Mocio Saburito and many others, and they've analyzed some of these ways in which there are closure properties of an organism. All of this I consider to be consistent with the kind of framework that I am advocating. So yes, it's mechanistic because it involves what the parts do and how the parts are organized, but the fact that they have a very special kind of organization is important, and it's something that some mechanists have maybe neglected or not fully appreciated. So I'm going to make that concession to the organicists. Another aspect of this is that this is a functional system. I think functions, meaning that the structures of functions, the parts of functions. What is a function? There's a whole literature on that. That literature has tended to focus primarily on either functions as causal roles or functions as selected effects. I do think there is a third way on functions that has advantages. I don't have time to defend it here, but I think functions as contributions to the goals of organisms is a very helpful framework that gives us just the kind of teleology that we need without mysteries and without having to invoke or build the history, the long-term history, the evolutionary history, the selection history of the system into the notion of function. And finally, there's another series of debates over explanation in the science of cognition. What kind of explanation is needed, what kind of explanation is appropriate, or how many kinds of explanation. Maybe we should be pluralist. Sure, we should be pluralist, but I do think that what are often listed as alternatives to mechanistic explanations, namely functional, computational, dynamical, topological, and so forth, are just ways of capturing aspects of certain specific kinds of mechanisms. Okay, so we got over evolution, brains, and mechanisms. Next, we have computation. And I do think computation is an important aspect of a science of cognition. It's another area where there's been a lot of debate. The main received view, the traditional view is that computation is digital. Maybe computation is classical, where classical involves something like a language of thought, and so that's the kind of thing that we need in order to understand cognition. We need to posit something like that. And even connectionism was not computational enough from that perspective. Now, of course, connectionists had a different idea, but what I have, and then some people say, no, well, like that can't be right. The brain can't be using a language of thought or be using digital computation. The brain's not digital. So therefore, let's ditch the whole computational idea. And again, here, I think there is a third way. Of course, the third way, I think, has become mainstream. Computational neuroscience has become mainstream now. But the point that I would like to make is that, number one, there are good reasons for maintaining a computational understanding of some aspects of cognition. Not that cognition is just purely computational, there's nothing else to it, but computation helps us understand a number of things, and especially how to understand, how to analyze, and how to model information processing. Okay, so few people, if anybody, deny that neurocognitive systems process information, and information processing is a pretty complex phenomenon, and computation is a kind of concept that can help us understand, get a handle on information processing. Now, you have to get the right kind of computation, not just any computation. You need to study so-called neurocomputation, the kind of computation that goes on in brains. I have argued that, strictly speaking, neurocomputation in general is neither digital nor analog in the paradigmatic sense of the general purpose analog computer. It might be analog in a broader sense, but an important point is that we need to understand neurocomputation in its own right, based on what we find in brains, not just based on some pre-existing theory of computation that has nothing to do with the brain. And this is in keeping with what I said in the previous slides, that structures and functions constrain each other. So we need to see what kind of structures we find in the brain, and what they can do computationally. Okay. Now, I've also argued that computation per se is compatible with the lack of representation. There's another whole traditional view to the effect that computation requires representation. I think that's incorrect, but that doesn't mean that neural computation proceeds in the absence of representation. In fact, my next slide involves representation and cognition. I do think that representation is hugely important to cognition. Again, this is another controversial area. Again, the received view is that there was some kind of language of thought, or maybe mental images, or maybe both. But here again, I think we need to look at what we find. What we find is what neuroscientists call neural representations. There's a lot to say about them that I don't really have time to get into, but one important point that I want to make, and that I've made before in collaboration with Eric Thompson, who's an experimental neuroscientist, is that, contrary to what many people used to think in this debate, especially philosophers, neural representations, or representations that are involving cognition, are not just theoretical posits that we postulate from the armchair in order to explain. They are features of neurocognitive systems that are observable in the lab. They are observed in the lab. They're manipulated in neuroscience labs. There's a huge body of research involving the observation and manipulation of different kinds of neural representations. We can argue all day long about what exactly is a neural representation, what is the best theoretical reconstruction of what is going on when neuroscientists manipulate neural representations. But what I think is going to be ultimately undeniable, if we are honest with ourselves, is that these things are seen in labs, and they're manipulated in labs, and therefore they're real. This is the famous Ian Hacking dictum: if you can spray them, they're real. So if you can manipulate them in the lab, they're real. And again, there's a lot to say about this. They are One very brief characterization is that there are dynamic simulations of their targets, and therefore neither truly language-like, nor quite image-like. Maybe some of them are somewhat image-like in some ways, but there's a lot more to them than being image-like. Okay, so they should be understood in their own right. And also another important feature is that they are intertwined with neural computations, because especially when there's plasticity involved, and there's a lot of plasticity involved in neurocognitive systems, the representations and the computations that process them are acquired or learned together. So they're sort of two sides of the same coin. That's very different from the way things are in artifacts that we build to compute over representations, where we have to think of what kind of computations we need to program or to get the system to acquire in order to get the right results that we want. Okay, so again, there's a special notion of representation that applies to neurocognitive systems, and it's not the same as those that apply to, say, public systems of representation like language or painting or photographs or digital computers. Next, situatedness and cognition. So here is another very controversial area where the received view I put in a kind of disjunctive form because it seems to me that a lot of people used to think, and many people still think, that either cognition involves computation and representation, or it's situated, where situated means it's embodied, embedded, and active, extended, and maybe even affective. Maybe affective is sort of a more recent addition to this list, but even if we stick just with embodied, embedded, and active cognition, some of these proponents of this situatedness of cognition were anti-representationalist and anti-computationalist, partly because I think they saw representationalism and computationalism primarily in their classical incarnations, and those were problematic, as I've just argued all along. But if we abandon the kind of classical ideas about computation and representation, and we go into a more neural framework, neuroscience grounded framework, we don't have to pick one or the other between a representational computational framework or a situated framework. We can have both. And in fact, I've argued that we need both. In fact, the two aspects need each other, because the situatedness of cognition, yes, yields a lot of insight. And even ecological psychology, which was a very kind of autonomous form of psychology from neuroscience, is important, and it draws our attention to environmental constraints and opportunities of the organism and how the organism interacts with its environment in like the real, like natural environment, not just the lab. And all of that is very valuable and it's very helpful. But still, we want to understand the contribution of the organism to all of this. How does the organism get to behave in those ways? How does the organism take advantage of those opportunities? How does the organism navigate the constraints? It's not like the organism just behaves, period. There's something going on inside. It would be great if we could understand that. So we do want to understand the internal mechanisms. And then, once we look at the information processing that's going on, it helps to think of the computations and representations that are going on. But thinking of the computations and representations that are going on also, in my opinion, requires to consider that constant interaction with the body and the environment that is going on for the organism, and how that helps the organism acquire those computations and those representations. And so that's where the computational story requires the situated story, even to understand the computations themselves. And it requires affect too, because for example, the very process of reinforcement learning, which is a hugely successful framework for understanding certain kinds of learning in many kinds of organisms, involves reward signals. And reward signals are signals that tell the organism if something's good or bad. So they're kind of very basic form of affect, like a very basic form of evaluation of the impact of a behavioral choice. So affect is built into the very learning, or at least an important kind of learning, from which organisms can develop computational representational abilities. Okay. So that situatedness is part of the story. And there's a lot of others, and I don't have time to get into all of them one by one, but these are, evaluation. I kind of mentioned it in the context of affect, attention, arousal, sleep are all aspects that were often kept, treated on their own, kind of as a special phenomena, maybe relegated to implementation stories, or the neuroscientists can deal with that, but we, the scientists of cognition, we don't need to worry too much about it. I mean, obviously I'm oversimplifying. Attention was always like a part of cognitive psychology, but what I want to point out is that these factors and others, okay, I don't have time to talk about everything, of course, but these factors are, again, intertwined with each other and with cognitive capacities, the acquisition and the execution of cognitive capacities. And so in the end, we do need to consider them together. And I've heard many talks, at this conference, where people are combining one or more of these aspects of cognition or the mind with others. So there was a talk earlier about the interplay between attention and introspection, for example. Just to, again, give examples, if the system detects a kind of value that's very salient in a stimulus, that will trigger bottom-up attention, and that will affect the kind of cognitive process that is going to be triggered. But that is in turn influenced by how aroused the system is. For example, if you're asleep, to just give a very basic example, you're not going to notice a lot of things. And if you're sleepy or not very aroused, you might not be able to notice things also. It does take a certain amount of arousal to notice things. And so sleep, in turn, affects arousal. It affects cognition in a lot of ways. There's a cognitive process that go on while during sleep. There's plenty of debate about what they are and how they help, but it's hard to deny that they help in a lot of ways. So all of this is also relevant. And the last bit that I'm going to mention is consciousness, where also, at least in the old days, certainly in the days of the cognitive hexagon, when the cognitive hexagon was first proposed, that was 1978, consciousness was at best an afterthought, mostly left to a few philosophers. Since then, as you all know, there's been an explosion of research on consciousness starting in the 90s, I would say. And by now, I think it's fair to say there is a relatively well-developed, quote-unquote, science of consciousness. I mean, there's all kinds of research programs and ideas and theories of consciousness. And this is, again, very contested, all the way down to the metaphysics of consciousness. And there's no way I can even begin to do justice to this topic. But I just want to point out that first-person data are informative, meaning asking people questions about the content of their mind, even conscious content of their mind. I mean, there's a question of whether, first-person data are always and only about consciousness. Not necessarily, but doesn't matter. The point is that they often give you useful information about the conscious states of the subject, and they are helpful. They're helpful to understand, the content of people's mind, which provide useful information, useful data for a science of the mind, including consciousness. This is not just about the so-called easy problems of consciousness, but also, in my opinion, this does not constitute any kind of new alternative first-person science of consciousness or of the mind. It's just another way of gathering data about the mind. Now, that's not to say that there's no mysteries about consciousness. Consciousness is a really tough subject, but it is to say that in a maturing science of the mind and of cognition, we are going to need to incorporate information about consciousness broadly construed, including phenomenal consciousness. And I have noticed in recent years there's a lot of good work that goes in this direction and that tries to combine not only standard behavioral and neuroscience techniques, but also some kind of first-person data and computational models to kind of get a better grip on at least aspects of consciousness. So the last thing I'm going to mention really quickly, this only applies to human beings, is language. Linguistics was one of the vertices of the cognitive hexagon. So certainly language is important when it comes to human cognition. And the basic phenomenon is that language seems to be acquired more efficiently and effectively within a critical developmental period by learning mechanisms that are, at least in many ways, amodal, like not tied to a specific sensory modality. Even children who are blind or deaf, they can acquire some form of language. So maybe sign language. So the received view, again, is that there is a domain-specific mechanism that possesses a universal grammar, and that's innately known, and it involves the language of thought, and it has a dedicated module called the language faculty. Each aspect of this view has been questioned. Each aspect, I think, is at least somewhat problematic. Again, there's no way I can begin to do justice to this topic, but one development that I think is very significant in recent years is that we have large language models now that do acquire the ability to process human language better than any other species does, meaning other animals. People have tried to teach language to various other species, like chimpanzees, for decades with very limited success. But large language models are artificial systems that exceed the ability of any other species, with the possible exception of humans, although they can do lots of things that no individual human can do. And they do that without relying on a Chomskyan language faculty. So they sort of learn from data. Now, they certainly have more data than individual humans do, but it's at least a proof of concept that it's possible to acquire some kind of linguistic ability without a language faculty. So that, in combination with a lot of other evidence, suggests that it's at least possible and maybe likely that even humans acquire language using a cluster of domain general mechanisms, though probably somewhat uniquely humans, or at least a combination of them is uniquely human, without having to possess prior linguistic knowledge, innate linguistic knowledge. And so any linguistic universals, if there are any, it might just be emergent from constraints on learning and communication. This is just sort of to point out that there is at least a plausible alternative to the, or a plausible family of alternatives to the traditional Chomskyan view. I don't even think that Chomskyan view is the majority opinion anymore, even in linguistics. although I don't know linguistics that well. The last point is just that some of these learning mechanisms that are involved in learning language might be, or in acquiring language, might also be involved in other capacities, especially capacities that are where humans are especially unique in their abilities. So the conclusion is that I think we can put it all together in the long run. Of course, this is a huge project that would involve the whole community, but the goal of this talk was to maybe generate some thoughts, in people about where they fit in this bigger landscape of the science of cognition. And the way I see it is that we can put together, within an evolutionary framework, within a mechanistic framework, a neurocomputational and representational story that is also situated and where the cognition is intertwined with valuation, attention, arousal, sleep, consciousness, and at least in humans, language. Thank you. Here is a partial bibliography of things that I've been involved with. I do have a brand new book that's an introduction to the computational theory of mind with Matteo Colombo. It just came out like a couple of weeks ago. Unfortunately, it's not free anymore to download, but if you email me, I can send you a copy. And then I have another book coming out in early 2024 with Neil Anderson. That's more just on physical computation, and it doesn't, it probably doesn't interest most of you, but if anybody's interested, let me know. And here is a partial acknowledgement. I have a list of some collaborators on the left and some other people whose work inspired me, especially on the right. There's too many people for me to list them all or thank them individually, but at least I have a list there. Thank you again.